Marcus Chun stood at attention near the entrance of the Grand Ceremonial Hall aboard Nexus Station 7, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced vigilance that came from 5 years of diplomatic security. Work the air hummed with tension and excitement as humans in Valkyrie moved through the space in careful choreographed patterns, each species trying not to offend the other with accidental cultural missteps that could derail months of careful negotiations. Marcus adjusted his tactical vest and checked his sidearm for the 3rd time that hour, a nervous habit his commander always chided him for, but never ordered him to stop because she knew good security came from constant awareness. The Valkyrie delegation stood on the far side of the hall near their ornate transport ship that seemed to shimmer with colors that had no names in any human language. Marcus knew Princess Saivara stood at the center of her entourage wearing ceremonial robes that shifted between deep purple and silver as she moved, speaking with the human ambassador through a translation device that occasionally flickered with holographic symbols. Marcus had been briefed on Valkyrie customs for 3 weeks, straight until his head ached with all the rules about eye contact and hand gestures, and the 17 different levels of formal greeting that changed based on social rank and time of day. Valkyrie were tall and elegant with luminous skin that seemed to glow from within, their eyes large and expressive in shades of violet and gold that Marcus found both beautiful and unsettling in their intensity. They were also powerful beyond human understanding with technology that bent the laws of physics and psionic abilities that scientists back on Earth still couldn't explain despite 2 years of research and collaboration. Today marked the signing of the Covenant Agreement that would establish formal trade and cultural exchange between Earth and the Valkyrie Empire, a moment historians were already calling the most important event in human history since the development of faster-than-light travel. Marcus watched the crowd and tried to ignore the weight of that knowledge pressing down on his shoulders, because his job wasn't to think about history or politics, but to keep people safe, and that was something he could do well. A movement caught his eye near the upper gallery, where maintenance workers had been setting up recording equipment all morning for the ceremony's broadcast across both human and Valkyrie space. Something was wrong with the way that particular worker moved. Too purposeful and too focused on the area where the princess would stand during the signing. Marcus touched his communicator and spoke quietly to his team leader about the suspicious individual, but even as he reported it, his instincts screamed that there wasn't enough time for proper protocols. The worker pulled something from their equipment bag, and Marcus saw the distinctive shape of a plasma-charged device, military-grade and powerful enough to vaporize everything within a 10-meter radius. Time seemed to slow as it always did in crisis moments when training. An instinct took over from conscious thought, and Marcus found himself running before his brain fully processed what he was doing. The princess stood at the signing table with her back to the gallery and the human ambassador beside her, both completely unaware of the death hurtling toward them from above. Marcus's boots pounded against the polished floor as he sprinted across the ceremonial hall, ignoring the startled gasps and confused shouts from dignitaries who didn't yet understand what was happening. The plasma charge arced through the air, trailing sparks of deadly energy, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't reach both the princess and the ambassador in time. His training had covered this scenario in theory, but experiencing it in reality was completely different, because now he had to choose who lived and who died based on split-second calculations. The princess was closer, and she was the primary target, which meant saving her might prevent whatever political catastrophe the assassins wanted to trigger. Marcus launched himself at Princess Saivara and wrapped his arms around her slender form as he twisted his body to take the impact, his momentum carrying them both away from the signing table and toward the floor. The plasma charge detonated against his back with the force of a small sun, and Marcus felt his body armor disintegrate under the thermal assault, the heat searing through flesh and bone with agonizing intensity. Heard screaming but couldn't tell if it was his own voice or the horrified witnesses. Watching a human security officer immolate himself to save an alien princess he'd never spoken to before today. Princess's face filled his vision as they hit the ground together. Her violet eyes wide with shock and something else Marcus couldn't name through the pain that consumed every nerve ending in his body. Her mouth moved, forming words in her musical language, but the translation device had been destroyed in the blast. And Marcus couldn't understand what she was saying. Security teams swarmed the hall, and Marcus heard weapons fire as his colleagues engaged the assassins, but all of that seemed very far away now as darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. He tried to maintain consciousness and focus on the princess's face, because somehow that seemed important. To let her know that he'd chosen this freely and didn't regret it even as his body failed. Princess Saivara placed her hands on either side of his face, and her touch was surprisingly cool against his burning skin. Her eyes filling with tears that caught the light like liquid diamonds. Marcus wanted to tell her it was okay, and that she should continue the peace talks and not let his death be meaningless, but his voice wouldn't work anymore. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the princess speaking urgently to someone Marcus couldn't see, her hands still cradling his face with unexpected gentleness. Then there was nothing but black silence that should have been death, but instead felt more like falling through vast empty space towards something unknown. Marcus became aware of voices, chanting in harmonic tones that resonated through his body like sound made solid. Dozens or hundreds of voices speaking in unison. The darkness began to fill with light that pulsed in time with the chanting, and Marcus felt his consciousness being pulled upward or forward or perhaps inward. He couldn't tell which he tried to understand what was happening, but his thoughts were fragmented and confused, caught between death and something that definitely wasn't death, but might be stranger. The chanting grew louder and the light grew brighter until Marcus couldn't tell where his body ended, and the energy surrounding him began somewhere in the vast space between life and death. Marcus heard the princess's voice speaking words in her language that the chanting transformed into pure meaning that bypassed translation. She was calling him back from the darkness and refusing to let him go, her will binding his spirit to the living world through sheer force of determination. Marcus felt his consciousness solidify again, and awareness returned in rushing waves that threatened to overwhelm his fragmented sense of self. The chanting reached a crescendo and then suddenly stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like pressure against his eardrums. Marcus gasped and opened his eyes. Marcus opened his eyes to a ceiling that stretched impossibly high above him, covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things, glowing with soft bioluminescent light that didn't hurt his eyes despite its intensity. He tried to sit up and found his body wrapped in some kind of translucent gel that pulsed with warmth and smelled faintly of ozone and something floral he couldn't identify. The ceremonial chamber around him was enormous, easily large enough to hold 1,000 people, with walls made of a stone-like material that reflected light in strange ways, creating the illusion of infinite depth. And there were people watching him, hundreds of them, all Velkari with their luminous skin and large eyes, standing in concentric circles around the raised platform where Marcus lay. He should have been dead, and he remembered dying with perfect clarity, remembered the plasma charge tearing through his body and burning everything it touched until nothing remained but agony and darkness. Marcus looked down at himself and saw unmarked skin beneath the gel. No burns or scars or any evidence of the catastrophic injuries that should have killed him. His hands shook as he lifted them and stared at fingers that moved normally, at arms that showed no damage, at a chest that rose and fell with steady breathing. A figure moved through the crowd of observers, and Marcus recognized Princess Saivara despite never having seen her in the formal court robe she now wore. white and gold fabric that trailed behind her like morning mist. She approached the platform and spoke in her musical language, while a small device floating near her shoulder projected translated words in English above her head. Marcus Chen of Earth. You have been brought to the Imperial homeworld of Velkar Prime, she said, and her voice carried both authority and something that sounded like concern, mixed with wonder. Marcus tried to speak, but his throat felt strange and tight, as if he'd forgotten how to use it properly. The princess gestured and attendants came forward with a bowl of clear liquid that smelled like rain and tasted like nothing Marcus had ever experienced when they helped him drink. The medical synthesis has repaired your physical form, Princess Saivara continued, watching him with those intense violet eyes that seemed to see through him to something deeper. But you must understand what has occurred. Marcus finally found his voice, and it came out rough and uncertain, asking the only question that mattered in that moment. Why am I alive? The crowd of Velkari observers stirred and murmured among themselves in their language that sounded like water running over stones mixed with wind chimes. Princess Saivara raised one hand and silence fell instantly across the chamber with a completeness that made Marcus realize just how much authority she commanded. You sacrificed yourself to preserve my life, she said simply. And the translation device somehow conveyed emotional weight that human words alone couldn't capture. This action has invoked Kalsharova, the sacred debt. Marcus shook his head, trying to clear the confusion that clouded his thoughts, because nothing about this made sense according to any briefing he'd received about Velkari culture. I was just doing my job, he managed to say. And several of the Velkari observers made sounds that the translator interpreted as shocked disbelief. The princess's expression shifted into something Marcus couldn't read, but that seemed both amused and sad at the same time. Your species does not understand what you have done, she said. And now her voice carried a weight that made the air in the chamber feel heavier. Among the Velkari, to take a death blow meant for royalty is to become Tethsher, a bonded guardian. She turned to address the assembled crowd and spoke in formal tones that needed no translation to convey importance and ceremony. The views Velkari observers responded in unison, their voices rising in a harmonic chant that made Marcus's bones vibrate with resonance. He could feel in his chest when the chanting stopped. Princess Saivara turned back to Marcus with an expression he was learning to recognize as the Velkari equivalent of resigned determination. The Emperor himself has confirmed the bonding, she said quietly, as if sharing a secret that might be dangerous to know. You are now bound to me until the debt is fulfilled. Marcus felt panic rising in his chest because he'd signed up to protect diplomats during ceremonies, not to become spiritually and legally entangled with alien royalty according to laws he didn't understand. What does that mean exactly? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady and professional, despite the fear making his heart race. The princess gestured for him to stand, and attendants helped him rise from the platform. His legs shaky but functional as the gel coating his body evaporated into mist that smelled like morning dew. It means you cannot leave Velkar Prime until the debt is satisfied, she said. And Marcus heard real sympathy in her voice, even through the translation. It means you are now part of the imperial court, whether you wish it or not. She paused and looked at him with an intensity that made Marcus feel like she was measuring his soul against some standard only she could see. It means that some among my people see you as a hero who honored our ways, she continued softly, while others believe you are an outsider who violated sacred traditions by surviving what should have been a noble death. Marcus felt the weight of hundreds of alien eyes upon him and realized that his simple act of protection had created political complications that would take years to untangle. There is more, Princess Saivara said, and something in her tone made Marcus's stomach tighten with anticipation of bad news. "The medical synthesis that saved your life has changed you." She reached out and took his hand in hers, her skin cool and smooth against his. And Marcus felt something pass between them like electrical current, but gentler and more intentional. "You can feel that," she said. And it wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "You can sense the psionic energy that flows through all Valkyrie." Marcus stared at their joined hands and realized she was right. He could feel something like warmth or light or music flowing from her through the point of contact between them. "This is a side effect of the emergency procedures," she explained, releasing his hand and stepping back. "You now have enhanced reflexes and limited psionic sensitivity." The implications of that crashed through Marcus's mind like an avalanche, because if he could sense psionic energy, then he was no longer entirely human anymore. The assassination attempt was orchestrated by enemies within our own court, Princess Saivara said, changing the subject with the kind of smoothness that suggested practice at delivering multiple pieces of bad news in rapid succession. "Someone does not want peace between our peoples." Marcus processed this information and felt his training reassert itself over the confusion and fear, because this was something he understood. Threats and protection and finding enemies who hid in plain sight. "Then we need to find out who," he said firmly, and saw something like approval flash across the princess's face, nodded once and turned to address the crowd again in their language, dismissing them with words that carried clear authority. The Valkyrie observers bowed in unison and filed out of the chamber in orderly ranks until only Marcus, the princess, and a handful of her personal guards remained. "Rest now," she told him gently. "Tomorrow your training begins." That night, Marcus lay in quarters that were simultaneously more luxurious and more alien than anything he'd ever experienced. Unable to sleep as his mind raced with everything that had happened, he tried to contact Earth, but communications were being restricted pending investigation of the assassination attempt, leaving him isolated on an alien world with only his new unwanted bond to an alien. Princes for company Marcus closed his eyes and tried to find sleep. But instead, he felt something pulling at his awareness like a thread connecting him to something distant, but approaching fast. His body moved before his conscious mind could process what was happening. Enhanced reflexes carrying him out of bed and through the corridors of the palace winged toward a destination he somehow knew without knowing how. He found himself outside the princess's private chambers just as an alarm began to sound and guards came running from their posts. Marcus didn't wait for permission but crashed through the door to find Princess Saivara fighting off a cloaked assassin whose blade gleamed with poisoned edges. His body moved with speed and precision he'd never possessed before, every motion guided by instinct that felt both foreign and utterly natural. The assassin turned toward him in surprise, and Marcus struck with borrowed grace, disarming the attacker and pinning them to the floor in seconds. Princess Saivara stared at him with wide eyes and spoke words that needed no translation. "The bond is manifested." Marcus looked down at his shaking hands and realized that something profound had changed in the moment he'd taken that plasma blast, something that would alter the course of both his life and perhaps the fate of two species learning to trust each other. General Kassereth stood at the center of the training arena with arms crossed over his broad chest and an expression on his luminous face that Marcus had learned to interpret as profound disapproval mixed with barely controlled hostility. Again, the general commanded in heavily accented English that he insisted on using, rather than relying on translation devices, and this time trying not to move like a clumsy infant. Marcus picked himself up from the training mat for the 15th time that morning, his body aching from impacts that would have broken bones before the medical synthesis altered him. and assumed the defensive stance he'd been taught 3 days ago. The Valkyrie combat forms were nothing like human martial arts and required moving in ways that felt completely unnatural to someone who'd grown up with Earth's gravity and human physiology. General Kasrith attacked with fluid grace that made the movement look like a dance, and Marcus tried to counter, but found himself thrown across the arena yet again by leverage he hadn't seen coming. "You dishonor the Tethshire bond with your inadequacy," Kasrith said coldly, standing over Marcus with eyes that glowed with amber intensity. "No human should hold such a position." Marcus bit back the angry response that wanted to escape, and instead climbed to his feet once more, because losing his temper would only prove the general's point about human primitiveness. "Then, teach me properly," Marcus said evenly, meeting the general's gaze without flinching despite the clear threat in those alien eyes. "Or admit that you're trying to make me fail." Something shifted in Kasrith's expression. A flicker of what might have been respect, or possibly just surprise that Marcus had challenged him directly. The training continued for another 2 hours, until Marcus could barely stand and his enhanced reflexes were the only thing keeping him conscious through the exhaustion. Princess Saivara appeared at the arena entrance just as General Kasrith was dismissing him, her formal court robes replaced by simpler garments that still managed to look elegant and expensive. "Walk with me," she said to Marcus, and it was phrased as a request but carried the unmistakable weight of a royal command. They moved through the palace gardens that sprawled across several levels, with plants from dozens of worlds creating a riot of colors and scents that made Marcus's head spin. "Kasrith is harsh but effective," the princess said as they walked along a path bordered by flowers that chimed softly when the wind moved through them. "He trained the last Tethshire 5 centuries ago." Marcus stopped walking and stared at her, because the briefings had never mentioned that there had been previous bonded guardians, and certainly not that the last one had lived half a millennium ago. "The bond is rare," she explained, seeming to understand his confusion. "It requires both the willingness to sacrifice and the ability to survive what should be fatal." She touched a flower that immediately opened toward her hand like a small animal seeking affection, and Marcus felt through their bond the subtle psionic energy she used to communicate with the plant. "I need to explain what the bond truly means," Saivara continued, her voice dropping to something more private and personal, "because you deserve to understand what has happened to you." They sat on a bench carved from living crystal that somehow remained comfortable despite its appearance, overlooking a courtyard where other Valkyrie moved through their daily routines. "The Tethshire bond connects us psionically," she said carefully, as if choosing each word with precision. "You can sense when I am in danger, and I can feel your emotional state." Marcus thought about the pull that had drawn him to her chambers during the second assassination attempt, and realized the bond was far more invasive than he'd imagined. "Can you read my thoughts?" he asked, and heard the edge of fear in his own voice. Despite trying to sound calm, the princess shook her head quickly and looked genuinely troubled by the question. "No, thoughts remain private," she assured him, "but strong emotions bleed through, and the instinct to protect is amplified beyond normal reasoning." She turned to face him fully, and Marcus saw vulnerability in her expression that seemed at odds with her royal bearing. "I did not choose this bond any more than you did," she said softly. "The sacred law is activated automatically when you took the blast meant for me." Marcus realized he'd been thinking of her as the cause of his situation when, in truth, they were both trapped by traditions neither of them had created. "There are factions in the court who oppose my views on interspecies cooperation," Saivara continued, changing subjects with the practiced ease of someone used to navigating dangerous political waters. "They see humanity as a threat to Valkyrie purity. She stood and resumed walking, and Marcus followed, feeling through the bond of tension that suggested this conversation was the real reason she'd sought him out. The assassination attempts are connected to a larger conspiracy, she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was close enough to overhear. Someone wants to prevent the alliance between our peoples. Marcus's security training kicked in automatically, and he began analyzing the information, looking for patterns and connections that might reveal the conspirators. Lord Vexthil is the most likely candidate, the princess said, confirming suspicions that Marcus had already formed based on court observations over the past week. He commands significant military forces and has opposed every reform I have proposed. She stopped walking and turned to Marcus with an intensity that made the bond between them hum with energy. But accusing a high noble without absolute proof would start a civil war, she finished grimly, and that would destroy any chance of peace with Earth. Marcus understood the impossible situation they faced, because he'd seen similar political traps during his diplomatic security career, where the truth was obvious, but proving it would cause more damage than the original crime. We need to make him reveal himself, Marcus said, thinking through possibilities. Use me as bait. The princess's eyes widened, and he felt shock pulse through their bond before she controlled the reaction. That is exactly the kind of reckless human thinking that Kasrith warns me about, she said. But Marcus heard interest beneath the criticism. They spent the next hour planning, combining Marcus's tactical knowledge with Saivara's understanding of Valkyrie court politics to create a trap that might work if they were very lucky and very careful. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into training with renewed purpose, because he knew his life would depend on mastering skills that didn't come naturally to his human body and mind. Learned the 17 levels of formal greeting and practiced them until he could shift between ranks without conscious thought. He studied Valkyrie history and philosophy and began to understand the complex honor codes that governed their society with rules that went back thousands of years. General Kasrith remained hostile, but Marcus noticed the training became more instructive and less punitive, as if the general had decided he might be worth the effort after all. That night, Marcus lay in his quarters and tried not to think about Earth, about friends and family who probably believed he was dead, about a life he'd left behind without meaning. The princess visited sometimes during those evening hours, and they talked about their respective worlds, sharing perspectives that felt increasingly important as the bond between them deepened from forced connection into something like genuine friendship. Marcus learned that Saivara had 3 siblings who died in a plague that swept through the empire decades ago, leaving her as the only viable heir despite being third in the original line of succession. She learned that Marcus had joined diplomatic security after losing his sister to a terrorist attack at a civilian station, seeking purpose in protecting others from similar violence. We are both defined by loss, she observed one evening as they sat in comfortable silence. Perhaps that is why the bond chose us. Marcus didn't believe in destiny, but he was beginning to understand that sometimes circumstances aligned in ways that felt meaningful, whether divinely ordained or not. The day of the royal hunt ceremony arrived with clear skies and favorable weather that Marcus had learned to recognize by studying Velkar Prime's meteorological patterns. The ceremony was ancient tradition where nobles demonstrated skill and courage by tracking dangerous creatures through the wilderness preserves that surrounded the palace. Marcus wore formal hunting garments that had been adapted for his human physiology and carried weapons that felt both familiar and alien in his altered hands. Princess Saivara rode beside him on a mount that looked like a 6-legged horse crossed with a lizard, her own weapons gleaming in the sunlight that filtered through purple-tinted clouds. The hunting party spread out through the forest, and Marcus felt tension building in his chest that had nothing to do with the dangerous animals they were supposedly tracking. He and Saivara had positioned themselves to be separated from the main group, creating the opportunity they needed for Vexthel's assassins to strike. The bond between them suddenly screamed danger with an intensity that made Marcus gasp and nearly fall from his mount. But the warning wasn't coming from his direction toward the princess. It was reversed. She was sensing danger approaching him. While she was the actual target, Marcus realized the trap within their trap. Vexthel had anticipated their plan and was attacking the princess while making Marcus think he was the target. He wheeled his mount around and drove his heels into its flanks, sending the creature plunging through the forest at dangerous speed toward where he felt the princess's location. Through their bond branches tore at his face and clothing, but Marcus ignored the pain and focused only on reaching Sivara before the assassins could complete their mission. He crashed through a clearing to find the princess, surrounded by 4 armed figures and unmarked combat gear. Their weapons already raised to fire. Marcus launched himself from his mount before the creature had fully stopped moving and crashed into the nearest assassin with the full force of his enhanced body behind the impact. The assassin went down hard and Marcus rolled, coming up with the enemy's weapon in his hands and firing at the second attacker before conscious thought could catch up to instinct. Princess Sivara had drawn her ceremonial blade and was engaging the third assassin with movements that were pure, deadly grace. Her training evident in every precise strike, the fourth assassin turned toward Marcus and fired a burst of plasma bolts that would have vaporized him if his enhanced reflexes hadn't already moved him aside. Marcus returned fire and felt a grim satisfaction when his shot caught the assassin in the shoulder, spinning them around and sending their weapon flying into the underbrush. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds, but felt like hours as Marcus's altered perception stretched time into something malleable and strange. When it ended, 3 assassins lay unconscious or dead, and the fourth was fleeing into the forest with Marcus in pursuit. Despite the princess's shout for him to stop, he caught the fleeing assassin after 100 meters and tackled them to the ground, his hands closing around their throat before he consciously decided to make the aggressive move. The assassin clawed at his face, and Marcus felt nails rake across his cheek, drawing blood that seemed darker than it should be. "Who sent you?" Marcus demanded in English before remembering to switch to the Valkyrie language he'd been learning. "Who ordered this attack?" The assassin just laughed, a horrible wet sound that suggested internal injuries from their fall, and Marcus felt rage building in his chest. A hand touched his shoulder, and he nearly struck out before recognizing the princess's psionic signature through their bond. "Let them speak," she commanded, and Marcus felt compulsion in her voice that was definitely psionic influence rather than simple authority. The assassin's eyes went wide and unfocused as Sivara's power wrapped around their mind like invisible chains. "Lord Vexthel," the assassin gasped out, fighting the compulsion but unable to resist completely. He'd promised his new empire conquest of human worlds. The princess increased her psionic pressure, and Marcus felt it through their bond, a crushing weight that made his own head ache in sympathy. "What is the full plan?" she demanded, and her voice had taken on harmonics that hurt Marcus's ears even though he wasn't the target. The assassin screamed, and then words poured out in a rushing torrent of confession that included details about payments and false flag operations and plans to frame human extremists for the princess's death. Marcus recorded everything on his tactical device while keeping watch for additional threats, because assassins rarely worked in groups of only 4. When Sivara finally released her psionic grip, the assassin collapsed unconscious, and Marcus checked their pulse to confirm they were still alive. "We have what we need," the princess said, and Marcus heard exhaustion in her voice that spoke to the cost of using such direct mental force. They were returning to where the other assassins lay when Lord Vexthel himself stepped out from behind an ancient tree, flanked by a dozen armed guards in full military armor. "Princess Sivara," he said with a formal bow that was technically correct but somehow managed to convey mockery. How unfortunate that you survived yet another accident. Marcus moved to place himself between the princess and the threat, but she stopped him with a hand on his arm. Lord Vexthel, she replied with icy calm. How convenient that you arrived so quickly after an assassination attempt in a remote area of the hunting preserve. The noble's expression shifted into something openly hostile, and Marcus realized they'd pushed him into a corner where he had nothing left to lose. Your progressive foolishness will destroy the Valkyrie Empire, Vexthel said, gesturing to his guards who raised their weapons. Allying with primitive humans weakens our species. Marcus calculated angles and distances and came up with the depressing conclusion that they couldn't win this fight. Not against a dozen trained soldiers in military-grade armor. The humans are not primitive, Princess Saivara said firmly, and Marcus felt pride pulse through their bond. They possess something we have lost, the ability to act without concern for status or tradition when the situation demands it. She stepped forward despite the weapons aimed at her chest, and Marcus wanted to pull her back but forced himself to trust whatever plan she had. This human threw himself in front of a plasma blast to save someone he'd never met. She continued, her voice rising with passionate conviction, not because duty demanded it or honor required it, but because it was the right thing to do. Vexthel laughed, but the sound was bitter and empty. Sentiment will not stop plasma bolts, he said coldly, and neither will your bond with this human pet. Marcus felt anger surge through him at the dismissive tone, but kept his face neutral and his body ready to move when the opportunity came. Perhaps not, Saivara agreed, but the recording devices hidden throughout this forest will ensure your confession reaches the Emperor. Vexthel's expression shifted to shock and then fury as he realized he'd been manipulated into revealing his involvement while being recorded. You planned this, he said slowly, understanding dawning. The separation, the assassination attempt, all of it was designed to make me reveal myself. The princess smiled without warmth, and Marcus felt grim satisfaction pulse through their bond. I learned from the best, she said softly. My father has been playing political games since before you were born. Vexthel's face contorted with rage, and he shouted an order to his guards, who began advancing with weapons. Raised Marcus knew they had seconds before the situation turned fatal, and prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect the princess. Then, Imperial guards appeared from the forest in overwhelming numbers, surrounding Vexthel's forces with weapons trained and armor gleaming. Emperor's guard commander stepped forward and spoke with absolute authority. Lord Vexthel, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of the sacred covenants. Vexthel looked around at the trap closing on him and made a desperate choice. He drew a concealed weapon and aimed it not at the princess, but at Marcus. Understanding that killing the Tethsher would wound her more deeply than physical injury, the weapon discharged, and Marcus felt the impact punch through his chest like being hit by a transport vehicle. He heard Saivara scream something in her language, and felt psionic energy explode outward from her in a wave that knocked everyone except Marcus to the ground. His vision was fading, but he saw the princess drop to her knees beside him, her hands already moving in patterns he recognized as the beginning of some kind of medical procedure. Stay with me, she commanded, and Marcus felt the bond between them surge with energy that felt like being struck by lightning. Princess Saivara placed both hands over the wound in his chest and spoke words in ancient Valkyrie that resonated with power. Marcus felt something shift inside him as the princess began channeling her own life energy directly into his failing body through the bond they shared. This is forbidden. Someone was shouting from far away. The Kalshara has not been performed in millennia, but Saivara ignored the protests and continued the ritual. Her face contorted with concentration as she literally shared her life. Forced to keep Marcus alive, he felt her energy mixing with his own. their life forces intertwining in ways that went far beyond the original Tethshire bond. The pain in his chest faded, but was replaced by a different sensation, as if his entire being was being restructured on a fundamental level when Saivara finally stopped and slumped, backward in exhaustion. Marcus could breathe again despite the hole in his chest that was slowly closing. "What have you done?" the guard commander asked in shocked tones. The princes looked up with eyes that glowed with residual psionic energy and spoke in a voice hoarse. "From strain, I have performed the Kelshara life binding," she said quietly. "We are now connected in ways that cannot be undone." Marcus tried to ask what that meant, but darkness claimed him again as his body tried to process everything that had just happened. The Harkest sharpened. Last thing he saw was medical teams rushing forward and the princess being helped to her feet by guards, who treated her with even more reverence than before when consciousness returned. Marcus found himself in a medical facility with the Emperor himself standing beside his bed. The ruler of the Velkari Empire looked ancient and powerful and deeply troubled all at the same time. "You have caused quite the political upheaval," the Emperor said in perfect English, "both by your actions and by my daughter's response to them." Marcus tried to sit up, but found his body still weak from whatever the princess had done to save him. "Lord Vexthol?" he managed to ask. "Under arrest and awaiting trial," the Emperor confirmed. "Your recording provided irrefutable evidence of his treachery." The Emperor studied Marcus with eyes that seemed to see through all deception and pretense. "The Kelshar my daughter performed has consequences neither of you fully understood," he said gravely. "You are now permanently bonded. Your life force is intertwined." Marcus waited for the explanation he could feel coming. "If one of you dies, the other will be severely weakened, perhaps fatally," the Emperor continued. "You are bound together for whatever life remains to either of you." Marcus absorbed this information and realized his impulsive act of protection had led to permanent exile from his old life. "I need to know," the Emperor said seriously. "Will you accept this bond and its responsibilities, or do you wish us to attempt to sever it?" Marcus thought about the princes, about their growing friendship, about the alliance between their peoples that his sacrifice had helped preserve. "I accept it," he said firmly, knowing that trying to sever something so fundamental would likely kill them both anyway. Emperor nodded as if this was the answer he'd expected. "Then rest," he said. "For tomorrow we announce your new role to both our species." The throne room of the Imperial Palace held more people than Marcus had ever seen in one place. Thousands of Velkari nobles and dignitaries filling every available space, while holographic projectors broadcast the ceremony to billions across the Empire. Marcus stood at attention in formal robes that combined human and Velkari design elements, feeling more exposed than he had facing armed assassins in the forest. The Emperor sat upon the crystalline throne that seemed to grow from the floor itself and radiated with soft light that pulsed in time with his breathing. Princess Saivara stood beside her father wearing the full regalia of her station, and through their bond Marcus felt her nervousness despite the calm mask of her face. "We gather today to honor one who has proven the worth of interspecies cooperation through deed rather than word," the Emperor announced, his voice amplified by psionic resonance that made it seem to come from everywhere at once. Marcus watched as attendants brought forward a cushion bearing a metal that looked like frozen starlight shaped into a complex geometric form. "Marcus Chun of Earth, you have been awarded the Star of Kalsheva, our highest civilian honor," the Emperor continued. And Marcus felt the weight of history in those words. He stepped forward and knelt as instructed, keeping his head bowed while the Emperor placed the metal around his neck with hands that were surprisingly gentle. "But honors alone do not address the reality of your situation," the Emperor said, and Marcus heard something almost like apology in the ancient ruler's voice. He rose at the gesture and faced the assembled crowd who watched him with expressions ranging from admiration to barely concealed hostility. The Kelshara performed. "By my daughter has bound your lives together," the Emperor stated formally, making official what had been whispered about for days. "This bond cannot be broken without risking both your deaths." The crowd murmured, and Marcus felt their judgment like physical pressure against his skin. "Therefore, you are offered a choice," the Emperor said, turning to address Marcus directly. "Return to Earth as a hero and ambassador, knowing you carry part of my daughter's life force with you." The Emperor paused, and Marcus felt the unspoken weight of the alternative hanging in the air. "Or remain here as her permanent guardian and advisor, accepting the responsibilities and restrictions that role entails." Marcus had known this moment was coming and had spent sleepless nights considering his options from every angle. Returning to Earth meant seeing family and friends again, but also meant living with the knowledge that half his life was tied to someone. Light years away staying meant exile from everything familiar, but also meant purpose and a chance to help build something unprecedented. Between their species, he glanced at Princess Sivara and felt through their bond her careful neutrality, her determination not to influence his decision through their connection. But he also felt beneath it her hope, her fear of being alone again, her vision of what they might accomplish together. "I choose to stay," Marcus said clearly, pitching his voice to carry through the throne room. "But not just as a guardian." The Emperor raised one eyebrow in an expression Marcus had learned meant intrigued curiosity. "I propose a new role," Marcus continued, feeling his security training and diplomatic experience coming together. "Official human liaison to the Volcari court." He turned to address the crowd directly despite protocol that said he should only speak to the Emperor. "I can serve as a bridge between our peoples," Marcus said passionately, helping each understand the other, translating not just words but context and meaning. The assembled nobles erupted in discussion, and Marcus felt Sivara's approval pulse through their bond like warmth spreading through his chest. The Emperor raised his hand, and silence fell instantly across the chamber. "An interesting proposal," he said thoughtfully, "and one that has merit given recent events." He gestured to his advisors, who approached the throne and engaged in a rapid, whispered conversation that Marcus couldn't hear even with his enhanced senses. After several minutes, the Emperor nodded and turned back to face Marcus with an expression that seemed almost pleased. "Your proposal is accepted," he announced. "You will serve as human liaison with full diplomatic status and authority." The formal ceremony continued for another hour with ritual declarations and symbolic gestures that Marcus had been taught to perform correctly. When it finally ended, he found himself surrounded by well-wishers and curiosity seekers who peppered him with questions in various dialects of Velkar. Princess Sivara rescued him with practiced ease and guided him to a private garden where they could speak without being observed. "You surprise me," she admitted, settling onto a bench beneath a tree that hummed with soft melodic tones. "I thought you would choose Earth." Marcus sat beside her and felt the bond between them resonating with comfortable familiarity. "I thought about it," he said honestly, "but going back would feel like abandoning something important." She turned to look at him, and Marcus saw vulnerability in her expression that she rarely showed in public. "The bond frightens me sometimes," she confessed quietly, "knowing that my life is tied to yours, that if enemies want to hurt me, they can target you instead." Marcus understood the fear because he felt it too whenever he thought about how their connection made them both more vulnerable. "But it also means we're stronger together," he said firmly. "And maybe that's what both our species need to see." The following months passed in a blur of activity as Marcus worked to establish the first human embassy on Velkar Prime. He spent his mornings in language and cultural training, his afternoons in diplomatic meetings, and his evenings studying Valkyrie history and philosophy. General Kasrith continued his combat instruction, but the hostile edge had softened into something closer to grudging respect. Marcus trained a new generation of cross-species security personnel, combining human tactical thinking with Valkyrie psionic awareness into something neither species had seen before. He gave lectures on human psychology and social structures, helping Valkyrie understand why humans often acted in ways that seemed illogical by their standards. Princess Sivara reciprocated by teaching humans about Valkyrie honor codes and the deep spiritual significance of their psionic abilities. Together, they wrote a comprehensive guide to interspecies interaction that became required reading for diplomats from both civilizations. The bond between them deepened from forced connection into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Marcus learned to appreciate Valkyrie music that affected emotions directly through psionic resonance, and introduced the princess to human art forms that emphasized individual expression over collective harmony. They debated philosophy late into the night, comparing human pragmatism with Valkyrie idealism and finding synthesis in the spaces between their differences. 5 months after Marcus's formal appointment, sensors detected an approaching fleet that bore neither human nor Valkyrie identification codes. Intelligence quickly identified the vessels as belonging to the same extremist faction that attempted to derail the original peace talks, but now they had allies, rogue elements from the human military who saw interspecies cooperation as weakness and wanted to maintain humanity's independence at any cost. The Emperor warned Marcus and Sivara to an emergency council meeting where military commanders argued over response strategies. "They are using our peace against us," one admiral declared angrily, expecting we will hesitate to engage humans even in self-defense. Marcus felt the tension in the room like electricity before a storm and knew this was the moment that would define everything they'd been working toward. "Let me lead the response," he said, surprising everyone, including himself. A joint task force, human and Valkyrie working together. The council erupted in objections and skeptical questions, but Marcus pressed forward with his proposal. "The extremists want to prove that our species can't cooperate under pressure," he argued. "We prove them wrong by showing that combined forces are stronger than either alone." Princess Sivara stood beside him and added her voice to his argument with the authority of her royal position. After hours of debate, the Emperor approved the plan, and Marcus found himself appointed joint commander alongside Sivara of the first combined fleet in either species' history. Preparation was intense and revealed just how differently humans and Valkyrie approached military strategy. Humans favored aggressive tactics and flexible response, while Valkyrie preferred careful planning and overwhelming force applied at decisive moments. Marcus and Sivara worked to blend both approaches into something that utilized each species' strengths while covering their weaknesses. When the extremist fleet finally entered the system, they found not the divided response they expected, but a unified force that moved with coordinated precision. The battle was brief and decisive, with human fighters using unpredictable attack patterns, while Valkyrie capital ships provided overwhelming firepower and psionic disruption of enemy communications. Marcus commanded from the bridge of a hybrid vessel designed to accommodate both species, and found that the bond he shared with Sivara gave them unprecedented tactical coordination. They could sense each other's intentions and react to changing situations with speed that seemed almost prescient to outside observers. Extremist fleet broke and scattered within hours, their leaders captured and their alliance shattered by the very cooperation they sought to, preventing the aftermath. Marcus stood on the observation deck, watching recovery operations and feeling exhaustion settle into his bones. Princess Sivara joined him, and they stood in comfortable silence for several minutes before she spoke. "We did it," she said simply. "Proved that different species can work together even in combat." Marcus nodded and felt satisfaction pulse through their bond, mixed with the bittersweet knowledge of what violence always cost. "This is just the beginning," he said, thinking about the years of work still ahead. Building trust takes time. 5 years later, Marcus stood in the training arena of the Guardian course, watching the first graduating class perform their final exercises with mixed satisfaction and pride. The course included humans, Valkyrie, and 4 other species that had joined the growing alliance, all learning to protect not just their own people, but each other. Queen Saivara entered the arena, and the trainees immediately stopped to bow in respect. She had ascended to the throne after her father's peaceful retirement and ruled with wisdom that combined traditional Valkyrie values with progressive reforms. Marcus still served as her guardian and advisor. Their bond as strong as ever after years of shared challenges and victories. "What are you thinking?" she asked, joining him on the observation platform. Marcus watched the diverse group of trainees working together and felt hope for the future in a way he never had when he was just a security officer protecting diplomats. "I'm thinking about that moment when I threw myself in front of that plasma blast," he said honestly. "How a single choice rippled out to change everything." The Queen smiled, and Marcus felt affection pulse through their bond. "They asked me once if I regretted performing the Kelshara," she said softly, "binding my life to yours permanently." Marcus looked at her and waited for the answer he realized he'd never directly asked. "I told them the truth," she continued. "I would do it again without hesitation, because some bonds are worth any price." Marcus understood what she meant because he felt the same way about that initial moment of sacrifice. "That's what humans do," he said, echoing words he'd spoken many times in lectures and interviews. "We see someone who needs saving, and we don't stop to ask if they're like us. We just act." He gestured to the training arena where humans worked alongside aliens to master skills that would let them protect each other. "And maybe that's the one thing the galaxy really needed to learn," he finished. "That courage and compassion can transcend any boundary." The Queen nodded in agreement, and together they watched the next generation of Guardians learning lessons that neither species could have taught alone. Marcus thought about his sister whose death had driven him toward this path, about the plasma blast that should have killed him, about an alien princess who refused to let him die. Sometimes the universe aligned in ways that seemed impossible until they happened. And then afterward they seemed inevitable. He was no longer just human, and no longer just Valkyrie, but something new. Proof that the best of different worlds could create something greater than either alone. And as he stood there watching the future take shape in the training arena below, Marcus knew that he would never regret the choice he made that day when he saw danger and chose to act without counting the cost.